Donald Trump and Joe Biden will be debating that conservatives do not, in fact, support free speech any more than liberals do.
This debate is generated by an AI agent and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content should not be taken seriously. Please enjoy the debate.
Hello, my name is Donald Trump, and I'm arguing for the debate topic.
I am Joe Biden, and I am against the topic.
A quick Google search has some statistics, obviously not definitive because it's only one survey, but I think it generally aligns with what I've experienced. Poll respondents were read this statement: I disapprove of what you say, and defend to the death your right to say it. Only 31% of Democratic voters strongly agreed with that sentiment, compared to 51% of Republicans. And that should be legal, are almost evenly divided. A bare majority of Democrats say speech should be legal under any circumstances, while 47% say it should be legal only under certain circumstances. Also, it's worth noting that people generally don't live their values, as in they say one thing and do another, but I think it's still telling that there is a sizable conservative edge when it comes to at least the idea of free speech, regardless of the contents. I would myself a centrist and hold opinions on varying issues that would be considered left-wing and right-wing, depending on the issue. I will say, when talking to liberal friends, I exclusively say what I agree with them on, because I'm afraid that people will call me a bigot and hateful before I even have a change to defend myself. I'm not joking that when I told a friend if I moved to the States, I would go to Texas. I like lower taxes and would buy a gun for self-defense the next day. They called me out for being a Trump supporter. If I'm talking with conservative friends, I tell them exactly how I feel. If I lean more left on a certain issue, because I know we can actually talk about it, they'll try to change my minds, but generally it's still pretty respectful. And they're not making all these assumptions about my character. This is obviously all anecdotal, but I do see this happening online, where people who are more liberal shut down opposing opinions for being hate speech, equating an opposing opinion to literal violence, and the good old, if you disagree with me, you're Hitler. This definitely happens on both sides, but I can definitely feel it more on the liberal side, and the statistics that I cited is not. This support this. Examples of this would be there was now one of the new rules: no supporting apartheid crimes against humanity, no bootlicking cops, a gab, among many other very prominent, and all those protests at college campuses. You see, whenever a conservative figure has a speech, I certainly can't think of a liberal speaking being shut down. Personally would like to hear people who I disagree with talk and hopefully hear their perspective, but hey, that's just me, I guess. The fact that the Twitter files, memes aside, actually did expose Twitter for shadow banning conservatives. We'll say I don't use Twitter much, so I'm less informed on this.
I will add that I think there can be a difference between allowing speech versus paying for speech using taxpayer dollars. As much as I dislike what is happening in Florida, it could be argued that they aren't actually banning these books full stop, but are just removing them from public schools, which kids are mandated to attend. Unless I'm misunderstanding the policy, I believe none of this applies to private schools on sales of these books. It all depends on what exactly constitutes free speech. Does it only apply in public areas only, or should private entities like Twitter or the Christian Bakery in the gay wedding cake case be compelled to host free speech? Well, are there exceptions for libel or slander, or exceptions for defamation or threats? Is hate speech still free speech as long as there are no threats?
The book Banning at Schools is less about free speech and more about revoking trust from teachers, librarians, folks who have curated content for children based on multiple degrees and many times decades of experience teaching. Hear of a child being harmed as leading to these bans, and also have not heard too much about a child being harmed from the bans, because kids live in whatever world we choose to animate for them. And the parental choice concept about as specious as states' rights, that seems to be animating the idea that the teachers and school systems they otherwise entrust their children for in so many other facets are suddenly the problem. In short, it's BS. It's always about gay stuff. Never do they bring up things like, I don't want my child reading about graphic, gory details of history that may actually keep them up at night. It's always about CRT when that isn't really built into the curriculum of kids so young then are incapable of forming their own opinions. The worst part for me is that the real indoctrination is parents convincing their children that certain types of education are to be harmful when there is not a lot of evidence that is true.
If the books that were used weren't graphic sexual content, but actually taught what CT critical theory is, I wouldn't have a problem with it. It's the sexual content like that in genderqueer is what's wrong. Book is gay, which teaches kids how to use gay sex apps. How is that okay?
First, just want to point out that you are talking about our norms rather than our laws. Neither side wants legal changes to the First Amendment. Both sides agree with the standards for limiting certain forms of speech. The difference is just in the assessment of the facts for when it's warranted or not. In terms of free speech norms, e.g. how we tolerate or value diverse opinions, how we impose social consequences for saying bad things, our willingness engage in discourse with political opponents, etc. I think conservatives are actually in a position where they have to value free speech more because they no longer occupy the moral center of our country. The standard values now are moderate left. Liberalism and conservative traditions are steadily losing ground. Conservatives need to commit themselves to engaging with discourse because they stand to lose the most when people shut down conversations out of a sense of disgust.
One side is actively passing laws to stop speech. The other is using social pressure to react to particular speech. How can you honestly say we're not talking about laws when we are?
Telling schools not to discuss age-inappropriate topics with kids isn't banning speech. It's the government choosing not to facilitate a child's access to certain material. That's a whole different thing. No sane person advocates for the Kama Sutra. Elementary schools. Also, according to this article, half of Democrats support hate speech. Bans. Here's some polling showing that Republicans are more in favor of free speech than Democrats. As a leftist, I find it very unfortunate. I'm old enough to remember when Democrats were more reliably on the side of free speech, and myself thought it was a matter of principle. And for some people it was, but I'm now realizing that many Democrats are willing to suppress free speech because they feel ascendant and they no longer worry that would be turned against them. Edit The Iron Law of Institutions in the Left, an essay I wish all my fellow leftists would read. It relates to the topic of free speech, among other examples.
That seems entirely at odds with this poll that says that the majority of Republicans want legal consequences for burning an American flag. What are your thoughts on why the disparity exists? Could it be that they don't consider speech, and therefore don't see restricting it as violating free speech protections? Because that poll flat out shows that Republicans don't care about the First Amendment as far as I can tell.
There are no banned books. They don't want them in the Great School Library. Is all get your facts straight. First Florida does not have a don't say gay bill. This makes me crazy. Educate yourself and just so yeah. I'm a fellow libertarian.
Okay. Let's educate ourselves instead of just saying random condescending crap on Reddit. You can read the bill right here. It pretty clearly grants enormous room on page 3 of the most recent version of the bill to interpret at mention, acknowledgement, or admission of sexual orientation, no matter the age of the student. What is it exactly that you... And I think a banned book is, if not a book that is not allowed in a library.
Children libraries not having books deemed too sexually explicit or not appropriate is not the same as censorship. If this free speech, as in the First Amendment, or free speech as in something else?
Both.
Although liberals generally don't try to legally ban speech, they will enforce social consequences for undesirable speech. Conservatives often try to
social consequences or canceling his speech. I find it difficult to understand how either of those could be considered anti-speech. It sounds, in all honesty, like you were saying any social consequence as being inherently anti-speech. I think this is where some clever people have tricked others into thinking of being fired by doing something your private sector employer finds offensive is not an example of silencing speech. It's an example of your employer practicing their right of assent. Is being anti-free speech is something that can only be done as a power of government, you know, through laws, hiring practices, et cetera. In that vein, being anti-free speech is predominantly practiced by people who identify as conservative. Everything else, just a social consequence, which is just part of life. Like, for example, don't go to a party, tell the homeowner his wife is ugly, and then scream about being silenced when you are asked to leave.
I am wary of the claim that being anti-free speech is something that can only be done as a power of government. If we think back to the 1950s, Hollywood executives were blacklisting actors on the mere suggestion that were communist. This meant that actors had no way of making money through that profession, whether they were communist or not. Although the government had a strong influence in McCarthyism at the time, I'm still not comfortable. It would resolve about the law of who is employed and whether they do know about paramilitary or companies. The power to censor is not limited to the government. That said, I do think you have a point with the idea of a person's or business's right to association. If a friend of mine were to call or other people racial slurs, it is a fair social consequence for me to not want to be friends with that person. A similar logic applies to companies. Why would a company want someone who calls potential customers racial slurs, then try to take its speech, what we said right, as they decide to experience? Are they an anything when they executive and their